Remember the 5th of November, the Owen Paterson Scandal and plot. Welcome to the Lib Dem Podcast. Welcome back to the Lib Dem Podcast, and today we were going to have a week off. We thought, not much going on, we've done lots of interviews, we can have a week off, but no, the circus that is this government has forced us to come back. But I should start the podcast. That was horrendous of me. To all our circus watchers, that was an incredible insult to your fine organisations. This government does not deserve to be compared to your, because it actually has a ringleader of a circus, unlike the Conservative parties at the moment. So joining us today, we have some new faces. We have some, I was going to say old faces, but we'll say established. So joining us is David McKensie. Hi, David.
Hi, John. Good to be back.
David is a Lib Dem campaigner that's been around the country, but last seen in Glasgow, Kelvin. We also have Sam Al-Hamdani. Introduce yourself, Sam.
Hello, Sam. Soon to be ex-chair of Oldham Liberal Democrats, but still doing all the counselling stuff. Very
good. And two new faces. Very excited to the podcast. We'll introduce who has impressed me on our LGA leaders meetings. We have Alison Bennett, who is the leader of I'm gonna get this Mid Sussex Liberal Democrats. Is that right? There we go.
That's right.
So many different Sussexes. They have to have a mid one. So welcome to the podcast, Alison.
Thanks for the invite, John.
And a very special guest today, who was for some reason might have more of an insight on our main topic than others. We have Helen Morgan, who was our candidate in 2019 for North Shropshire, who is now going to be in the news quite a bit, I think, that constituency. Welcome to the podcast, Helen.
Hi, thank you for having me. It's great to be on.
Right. Okay, David, shall we start with you and trying to explain just what has happened in this last week? So assume our listeners know absolutely nothing. I've never heard of Owen Paterson. What has happened this week?
Yeah, well, basically, Owen Paterson has obviously been targeted for a lobbying scandal. He's been taking, I think it was £8,500 per month from a large pharmaceutical company called Radnox to lobby on their behalf. Obviously, as well, Owen Paterson is a former government minister and was lobbying things like the International Aid Department, as well as looking at what potential contracts from a health perspective Radnox could pick up. So obviously not exactly the done thing. I should say he continues to deny any illegal activities and also denies doing any wrongdoing in taking this money, and says it was all declared and upfront in parliamentary expenses. But obviously it's not a good look, and also it's not a good look for the government that they were prepared to try and push this under the carpet, and also blatantly try and change the rules to cover up for the scandal that was coming.
I mean, do you know what he says is his only crime? That he used House of Commons notepad paper. And I think that if that is his perspective, because that's it, because there's been no contrition. Alison has that on all this issue, the fact that whatever Owen Paterson, and it was a damning report and it took place it wasn't just a one incident. It started in 2016 and went through several years of him doing various lobbying issues. There really was no denial on him that he had done anything wrong, really.
No, and in his resignation statement yesterday, he maintains his innocence. I thought the resignation statement actually was like something out of a Shakespearean tragedy. It was awful and terribly sad, but absolutely no contrition. And so I feel for him and his family on a very personal level. But in terms of what went on, and I think he probably did do the things he was accused of, yeah, he's not backing down.
But no Tory has said he didn't do anything wrong, though. This is the strangeness of this argument. And Helen, you've been in the midst of this, but it is strange because not one Tory on all this debacle that's happened this week in terms of he was found guilty. It was a really damning verdict. No Conservative has said that he didn't do what he did because it was so obvious that he had. And yet then they tried to change the rules afterwards. They couldn't have handled this any worse, the Tories.
No, not at all. I mean, I think, the rules are there not only to protect the public from people taking money and the people giving them that money getting a gain. They're there to protect the individual from accusations of inappropriate behaviour. So I think if you break those rules, it doesn't matter if there are kind of mitigating circumstances. The rules are clear and explicit, and if you break them, you risk people making the wrong or even the right conclusions about why you broke those rules. So, the rules are clear and they were broken, and from that perspective, the other circumstances around them are irrelevant, really.
Yeah, and so I suppose the other circumstances that's come up, and this is something where the plot gets very thick with this, Sam, is obviously the death of Owen Paterson's wife, who sadly took her own life last year. Now, what has sat very uneasy for me is that I haven't heard a single MP bring this up as any sort of issue whatsoever in terms of, the contributory factor of the investigation. It was only Owen Paterson that seems to have brought this up about his wife's death. But it's just made the whole thing very ugly and also quite tragic as well, Sam.
It is, and it is clearly a horrible thing for him and his family to have gone through, and everyone has every sympathy for him, his family, what he's gone through. But that does seem to be a different thing to what is being discussed as part of this case. And as you said before, John, this is something that's been going on since 2016. So, I mean, I don't know what his personal circumstances were at the time, but that doesn't seem to be related. It is possible to hold those two things separately and to have those as completely separate concerns. And everything I've seen so far has done that. Has held sympathy for him, which, in terms of what he's gone through, he clearly deserves that. But in terms of what he seems to have done in terms of asking questions and accepting that money, that's not, it was a cross-party committee and there were Conservatives on it. They found him guilty of that.
Yeah, unanimously. There was one Conservative, I think it was Bernard Jenkins, who was on the committee that said, because he had a close friendship with Owen Paterson, recused himself from the committee. It was unanimous, that decision against him. That's why it's been really. And I'm interested to see anyone from the panel here actually talk about, have the Tories just massively mishandled this in terms of made it far worse for Owen Paterson as well? Because
I think they have, to be quite honest with you. I think if they had taken a view that there was admission of wrongdoing, that had broken the rules, that's inappropriate, but maybe the sanction should be reduced out of compassion for him under these tragic circumstances. I think a lot of people locally would have been fairly happy with that. But the fact that Boris Johnson has this appalling judgment and decides that he's just going to change the rules to get his man out of a difficult spot, I think has gone down very badly locally.
Now, there's a lot of, Sam, so just before I bring you in, there's a lot of chat as well about, is there some ulterior motive behind this? Because obviously one of the things when the Conservatives, the Angela Leadsom amendment came in, quite a number of people who then voted to change the rules had been under investigation. And also it was a thing that Owen Paterson also voted for the amendment that would have dealt with him, which again seems all very unseemly. But do we think this is an ulterior motive? Someone saying, Boris Johnson is also under investigation at the moment. Now, is that just us being on the other side of this, thinking, getting a few conspiracy theories in our head, or do we not take anything for granted with this government?
Well, in terms of ulterior motives, we talked before about whether you are looking to be guilty or are guilty, and they are the rules are there, we said, to stop you from coming across as having done the wrong thing, as well as to stop you doing the wrong thing. Well, clearly the government here, whether there are ulterior motives or not, play into that massively. They are doing something which looks horribly guilty, regardless of whether we think they are or not. And that also, I mean, one of the things I did was, when I sort of read through this, was go back to when a lot of these rules were introduced and looked at things like Neil Hamilton. These rules were introduced because there was a massive sort of culture of at least letting things go, if not outright corruption. And that needed to be dealt with. And we seem to be going through the same thing again, this time undoing all the positive changes that happened after a case of something similar. I mean, in that case, he was putting forward amendments on behalf. He wasn't just lobbying, he was changing legislation. But it just seems like the same motives and the same philosophy and the same belief in a lack of guilt, the same lack of shame coming through again.
So I think what's perhaps different now compared to the 1990s is that at least in the 1990s, regardless of what you think about John Major and the whole, I don't think he was encouraging the undermining of standards.
True, that's true.
Whereas where we're at now, we have a prime minister who doesn't care and hasn't cared repeatedly on a number of things ever since he became leader and before. And it probably served his purposes to undermine the standard system. And he doesn't care what the optics are like.
Hello, John from the Lib Dem Podcast here. We are delighted to say that this episode is sponsored by Patersons. Now more than ever, you need a professional-looking online presence and website. Patersons have been helping Liberal Democrat campaigns succeed for 18 years. Their Lib Dem Foci package combines a website, social media and email system to help Lib Dems win. You'll receive great support from real people, fair pricing and a huge range of features to choose from. Paterons are already the bespoke developers for Lighthouse, Lib Dem Draw Online and the LD Directory. They combine a talented system design with an unrivaled understanding of our party, our data and our systems. To find out more, check out the Paterons website at paterons.co.uk/liberal-democrats. Now, on with the podcast. In the papers today, there's a lot of complaints from Tory MPs, and it's widely briefed to the kind of Westminster journalists how displeased they are with Boris Johnson and the Chief Whip, because a lot of these MPs that voted, including one of the Preston MPs, voted for this amendment, and then so they've had to walk up this hill, then have walked back down it. If you were a Tory that was unhappy about this, to get them to do that and then retract it a day later, you just look like an idiot. And I can't imagine. I mean, David, the morale within the Tories, not obviously something I'm overly concerned about. And hello to all people from CCHQ, by the way. We forgot to say hello to you this episode. But it would drive me absolutely spare if I had to do something I wasn't comfortable with and then had to change it 24 hours later.
Yeah, and let's be honest, the whips will have come in with tactics to get people to vote for this. It will probably make them feel extremely uncomfortable themselves. And then to obviously, as you say, retract that a day later, it's not going to do anything but create ill feeling amongst and I'd say some very senior Conservative MPs that have served, time in government and have also been in Parliament for decades, who are very, very unhappy with this. But as you say, I think this is endemic of Boris Johnson's premiership. And I do not think this will be the last sleaze or corruption scandal that's going to come from this government.
Do you think this is a big issue? And we're inside I was actually genuinely quite surprised they wrote back on it the day after. I was surprised with some of the headlines, obviously, because I always try and take a view as we're inside this kind of political bubble. Do most people just factor in politicians are kind of corrupt or sleazy as much as we try and prove otherwise as good old Lib Dems? But actually, you think of general public opinion of politicians is fairly low. Mm-hmm. Were we surprised that the government U-turned? I mean, did it really cut through that much with the members of the public?
I think so. I was at work on Wednesday, and then just kind of around and about a little bit. So we didn't speak to hundreds of people, but the people I did speak to were pretty shocked. I think it offends people's sense of fair play, to be quite honest with you.
No, and that's really, it must, like I said, it must have then, someone who works for myself at home, trying to get political opinions out of my dog is very difficult. But that is actually very interesting to know that it did actually cut through. Now,
although John, I heard Bosley said it had been a rough week.
Oh no! So this is what happens when David's sleep deprived and comes on the podcast. He starts making dog jokes. Now the fallout from this. So Labour actually, and when I listened back, I thought Angela Rayner did quite well at Prime Minister's questions, particularly for those of people that saw it, because obviously Rob Roberts, who had been found to have sexually harassed. I think it was it one of his staff members as well? I can't remember, or someone within Westminster. They didn't want to change the rules for him, and even though the census, but were willing to do it with this. It came across like just a complete shambles from the Tories. And do we think this is endemic of this? You've talked about Boris's premiership, but the idea that things aren't thought through, whether that's the Brexit deal, whether that's Afghanistan, whether whatever, that they just seem to be just flying by the seat of their pants. I mean, Alison, what are your impressions?
Wasn't it David Cameron that used to be called the essay crisis prime minister? That he used to just deal with the thing that had to be dealt with, by midnight that night. And I think Johnson's taken it to a whole new level. And I think it just comes down to the fact that he doesn't care. He's not a details person. And it's all about him and his status as world king.
Yeah. And like always, you talk about, and Sam, that the cover-up is almost worse than the crime. And actually, we're going to talk about North Shropshire in a second. But actually, if there'd been a recall petition for Owen Paterson before this happened, how many people? It would have been quite a tough slog getting those signatures, and it would have been a much tougher fight than the subsequent by-election is going to be, because it's basically elevated this issue into a big national issue on the front of all the pages.
Yeah. And he had such a massive majority. There was clearly massive popularity there, and trying to get a recall petition when you've got that level of support is probably, I've not tried to do it myself, but it looks like I think that will be difficult. But we've talked previously about how both, the lack of cut through on opposition to this government. And I think you asked before, has this issue cut through? The reason why the Labour Party were able to get traction and oppose this, and we've done the same, is because it has had that broader connection. The public were already angry about this. And therefore, when we made the objections, when Labour made the objections, it married up public opinion with the attack line that we were taking on this. And so that is where you get that cut through, that kind of impact, so that we can take on this Conservative government and it be effective. But it relies on that kind of that marriage, that people do already have some thought that, this is a government that is doing things wrong and we don't think it's acceptable, and you're saying what we think. And that is what an effective opposition is when people think that the government is doing wrong, carrying that forward, making that point and making it larger and better.
Do you think this government actually doesn't act like it's got an 80-seat majority? I'm thinking of like the three kind of big kind of public scandals that have happened. There's been lots of scandals that we would love to have got it, but the ones that have really caught the public eye were Dominic Cummings, Matt Hancock, and now this. All of them have had some sort of level of sleaze, and obviously the Matt Hancock one shamefully had a little bit of sex involved as well, which none of us want to see that video ever again. But again, it's like, again, on all those issues, there was that ring of protection. Dominic Cummings has done fine. Nobody, he was just testing out his eyesight. Matt Hancock, this is all thing. And then it was only at a point when the public got engaged did they very quickly just cut that limb off.
Well, is it to do with the papers? Looking at the headlines yesterday, I think the Express and the Telegraph didn't lead on Paterson yesterday, but the Mail did, didn't they? And it was, MP shame and big headline. And is it that influence that is driving them? If we've upset the Mail, that's when we need to rethink.
It's interesting. Go on, Dave.
Is it also, John, because when you're talking about these three sort of scandals that have come up, is it purely because, as the Prime Minister, he does not have a leg to stand on to criticise these people for doing these things? Because sex scandals, yes, he's had them. I'll say allegedly, because I don't want to get myself into any legal problems, but allegedly when he was London Mayor, there was a lot of questions around people that were being given funding, etc., and their access to Boris Johnson. I think it becomes difficult for somebody like that to take a stand against sleaze and corruption, because what's their position on it?
And it was really interesting. I recommend to all Lib Dems listening to this to listen to the Times Red Box podcast. I find it really good as a kind of a more neutralish kind of podcast. And they do a monthly focus group. And the one that was like 2 days ago was talking about perceptions of Boris Johnson. And the public, and it was a focus group, so it's not an opinion poll, so it is a very small number of people. But what you were just saying there, David, they kind of knew he was a clown, and they knew he wasn't trustworthy, but they kind of thought he was a genuine clown, as in, so he wasn't a clown trying to pretend to be anything else than a clown, which I think sometimes can frustrate us in terms of why do people not get so angry with Boris Johnson all the time, whether that's the Akuri incident I think you were referring to, David, or all the other stupid stuff that he does. But actually, it's these, I wonder if it's the drip effect of all this stuff now that is showing, that I certainly seeing when I'm out canvassing, support for Tories and moderate kind of One Nation Tories slipping away in terms of like, just the government just seems like a complete shambles. So, but that to one side. So Owen Paterson has now stood down, which means now North Shropshire is going to have a by-election. And of which case, Helen, you are the perfect person to talk to, as in, because you fought the seat in 2019, but also part of the Lib Dem team over there. So do you want to give us and our listeners a little bit of a brief of what that seat is like? How powerful are the Lib Dems? Is it a growing team, etc.?
Yeah, so I think the overriding thing about North Shropshire is that it's a campaigning nightmare. So it's one of the most sparsely populated or dispersed populations in the country. And we've got 5 market towns, the biggest of which is Oswestry, and everyone else lives in villages with up to about 200 houses in them. So it's there's a lot of space to cover and people are quite thinly spread out. You can't deliver 100 leaflets in an hour in North Shropshire. Or in certainly large swathes of it anyway. So I was saying before we went on air, and we feel really as if we're sort of on the cusp of making some big inroads here. In 2019, we came third, we got 10%, but we had doubled our vote share. That was pretty good in a Leave voting area. And we were also caught up in some of the issues around getting leaflets out with the problems with the printing that were had across a number of constituencies. So, we've got a really motivated team. I think we hand delivered 30,000 leaflets in 2019. So a motivated team. And then we had local elections this year. Shropshire Council's been in a bit of a state of crisis, I think it would be fair to say. It's Conservative run and has been for years. We have some of the worst pothole issues in the country, and we have this scandal over buying shopping centres for £50-odd million and them now being essentially worthless, and most of that decline in value happening before the COVID crisis. So there've been some really meaty issues to get stuck into here. And sort of having come from nowhere, really, we nearly took 5 seats. We were within 100 votes of 3, and we were within another 100 of another 2. So we felt as if we did really well. We came a clear second. We fielded far more candidates than Labour or the Greens. So we felt as if we did really well. We've got a proper team. We're very well organised. And we just didn't quite have enough time, I think, with COVID to get those final deliveries out that would have got us those 5 seats. So in some ways it was a little bit disappointing. And in other ways, as I say, we feel as if we're on the cusp of making real inroads here.
It's so just to give everyone listening a bit of a profile. So this seat has, last time it wasn't Tory, was 1832. Is the correct time as well. But you know what?
I remember it well, John.
Yes, I was going to say, yeah, it's a good job Richard Kemp isn't on, because he'll talk about that particular election. But so it has been a Tory safe seat. Owen Paterson got 62%, 62.7% of the vote. But let's go right back to square one now. Does the panel have views, and Helen, you can sit out this one if you want, about whether we should stand in this election? Because whenever there's a by-election now, there are people on particularly Twitter saying, Progressive Alliance, we're never going to get rid of the Tories if we don't stand, and all the rest of it. We should have Martin Bell come back or something like that and do this thing. Obviously, slight difference here. When Martin Bell stood, he was standing against the person accused. So this is slightly different. But let's go with you, David. What are your thoughts? Do we stand? Do we fight this?
Yeah, I think we do. I think you're absolutely right in what you said there. When I had the privilege to interview Martin Bell last year, actually, and that really was a case of he's standing against somebody who was in the midst of a corruption scandal that wanted to be elected again, and it was about a joint effort to unseat somebody that was in a very safe Conservative seat that neither probably Labour or ourselves at that time had any real chance of winning, and it was to make a stand against that. I think this time, obviously, with Owen Paterson having stood down, I think it's only right from a democratic perspective that we allow the general public to make a decision about what party and what values would best represent North Shropshire, and also we give them the opportunity to have their democratic right to pick. And I honestly think, just based on what Helen said, and also the things that I've seen from the area, that we have a very good chance as well of, that sort of that blue wall seat of really making inroads there. So I think it's down to us to stand in this election.
Alison?
I think I might have been interested if there had been a non-party aligned candidate standing on an anti-sleaze ticket. But already this morning, I've just had the news on, and Labour have said they've ruled that out, having had conversations with us and the Greens. So it's off the agenda. And on that basis, yeah, we should stand and we should do our best. If nothing else, it will build our infrastructure in North Shropshire, I imagine, Helen, and give members, something to work towards. And coming from a large rural area, not dissimilar to North Shropshire, that's all to the good.
Sam?
I mean, I've just had every thought that I was about to say taken out of my and already said. It's exactly that. There's not the same clarity of, Martin Bell was a very clear choice and was a very obvious candidate to stand against Neil Hamilton, and there doesn't seem to be any equivalent of that. So this is about giving people that option to look at what the alternatives are, and for everybody to have their say as well. This is a situation where there is a real challenge to this government, that they engaged with the idea of saying this is okay. And so everybody needs to be able to stand up against that and say, no, it's not. We are different to this. We're different in a different way to Labour are. We need to put across our values and how they are a challenge to what has happened. And everybody needs that opportunity.
And it's interesting, and again, I'm not trying to make Helen blush here, but obviously 2019, we doubled our vote. Okay, we still came third, but we got, say, 10% of the vote in an election where Lib Dems were squeezed every which way. And actually, it's very interesting. I'm actually quite excited about this by-election, not just because do we count Shropshire as being northwest? I want to say it's north. I want to say it's northwest.
It's definitely west.
Having a by-election that's within driving distance of people like myself, as well as it's very easy to get people from Wales and the Midlands, everywhere to come to that thing. It gives us a chance. And I'm always of the opinion it's a chance not just to do what Alison said, is to engage the local party. We saw in Cheshire and Amersham that even if we hadn't have won Cheshire and Amersham, which it was brilliant that we did, we had got thousands of points of data, loads of poster sites, dozens upon dozens of new local activists getting involved in politics for the first time. There are broader successes than just winning. And I suppose, Helen, that's something you'll be considering as things go forward.
Yeah, I mean, as a party, as I say, we've got quite a good network of activists and deliverers, but we're a small party ultimately, so we really want to engage our members. And we sent an email out last week, and we had a really good response from it. So I think people are ready to be engaged. Just in general, I mean, I'm not a big fan of standing down a candidate, because I think if we want to change politics in Britain as political parties, we need to make a case that we can win, and that people should vote for us on our own merits. And I think once you start standing down and saying, well, we're just what's the word I'm looking for? A sort of a subsection of Labour or whatever. Yeah. I think that's unhelpful. I think we need to be able to stand on our own 2 feet and make our own case, as do the other parties. And I think, a better political future involves people understanding what those parties stand for and wanting to vote for them.
And significantly, the Labour vote went down quite a lot in 2019 as well. And I think, am I right? I think you'll correct me that if you took the local elections this year, the Lib Dems came out as second place in North Shropshire.
Really second, yeah. We fielded far more candidates than anyone else other than the Conservatives, and we got 20% in the local elections. So that was good. We were. On a lot of ballot papers, there was just us and the Conservative candidate. There was no other candidates fielded. So we fielded we're the best organised, certainly.
And I suppose to any of our listeners who don't know how they can get involved, firstly, I made a joke on the Lib Dem, on one of the Lib Dem groups, said, look, an hour's passed, surely the virtual HQ must be set up by now. And it already has.
It was.
So it had. So by all means, do. If you're a Lib Dem member, there is a virtual HQ on Facebook where you can find out what's going on. If you can't get to Shropshire yourself when the by-election happens, there are always ways. Money is a key thing with by-elections. Cost a lot of money. So if you're able to donate money to help the campaign, that's brilliant. You can also phone calling and everything else that you can do from a distance, or if you can get there and help out, please do. But also it's also an excellent way to energize your troops as well, because lots of us have elections next year. I certainly do. And by-elections can be an excellent way of motivating people, actually, because we've got to remember, whatever happens in North Shropshire, that actually we've got lots of elections across the country, and using that to build up your team. Look at this. Look what's happening. It's a great, like a weekend out or whatever out to go and do that. I think it's very useful. I mean, Alison, did you get yourself to Cheshire and Amersham? Would you always recommend a by-election to get your spirits up?
Yeah, I made it to Cheshire and Amersham, and actually the first place I ever knocked on a door was in the Richmond Park by-election. I sort of idly thought, yeah, I'll do that for the day, potted over. And they said, would you like to knock on a door? There's this thing called Connect. I'm like, okay. Next thing I knew, I was knocking on doors. So yeah, it's a great way to learn. And then I came back to Mid Sussex and told everybody in Mid Sussex, there's this thing called Connect. There's a thing called Minivan. We should use it. And as you say, it sort of spreads skills and spreads expertise.
And I suppose it's one of those things, Sam and David, that we've got really nothing to lose in terms of selections. It's almost one where we can just go and enjoy it almost. Just go, campaign. We're on the right side of this. And I think there will be a lot of moderate Tories that will either not want to vote, given what's happened, or be willing to lend their vote to another party. And hand on heart, we saw in Cheshire and Amersham, if Lib Dems look like they're the big challengers, then it will be us and nobody else.
Yeah, I mean, the last by-election I went to was Batley and Spen, and that was one where, a very different environment. But we were out going around kind of conservative areas where, the wards where it's Conservative and Liberal Democrat challenging. And that sort of, even there, in a very different environment, that was still happening. We were still talking to sort of moderate Conservatives and them being very positive towards us. So there's a real opportunity for a lot more of that, and that energizing. Even on Batley and Spen, where we weren't ever going to challenge, going around those wards still felt really positive. And there's the opportunity for that on a much larger scale, I think. And certainly, I was working out my driving times to get down there. I'm still going to be, I'm aware of local elections coming up next time, so I'm going to, it's going to be a balanced thing, but I will certainly be down a couple of times, I think.
You can hold him to that, Helen. He said it publicly now. David, of course, this isn't the only potential by-election that's coming, and I'm not talking about, obviously, the David Amess one. Claudia Webb has been sentenced for in Leicester East MP. Now, she has been sentenced by a judge. Now, she is currently an independent because she had the whip removed. Now, the sentencing was so severe that it passed the threshold that a recall petition can now be done. Now, I'd love to get your feelings on it, David, but my opinion, if I was running Labour HQ, I would get that recall petition going as soon as possible, because they've only got a 6,000 majority over the Tories in Leicester East, while the Owen Paterson by-election is happening in North Shropshire. I'm really struggling with that word today. North Shropshire. Why would Labour not do that until the Tories' attention is split? That's what I would do if I was Labour. What are your thoughts, David?
I would tend to agree. I mean, I think from everything I'm hearing from former people, that I used to be involved with in the Labour Party, I think that's probably already underway. So I've seen there's already been pressure put on Claudia to do the honourable thing and resign. And walk away to avoid a situation where obviously her constituents have to go through a very difficult recall petition to oust her from the seat. Whether that remains to be seen, whether she will make that decision to step away. But yeah, I do think we will get to a point where there is another by-election in Leicester East. The other interesting thing is I have seen intimations by one George Galloway that he intends to stand in any by-election that would be happening in Leicester East. Obviously, from what we saw in Batley and Spen, you can probably look at what he intends to do in that seat and the things he intends to target, which also makes it very difficult for Labour in that regard. So they're going to face a difficult challenge of holding off the Tories holding off George Galloway eating into a certain section of their electorate, and trying to get rid of Claudia Webb at the same time. So, yeah, I think it's going to be a very difficult by-election for Labour.
Thoughts of the rest of the panel?
Well, I'm wondering. Sorry, I was going to say, John, isn't your hope that Labour get going in Leicester East so that they kind of ignore Shropshire North and let us sort of sail through?
That's kind of that. But I also think, catching up on what David said, I think that's Labour's best chance as well. I think this Leicester East is going to be very difficult. I think the whole of North Shropshire is going to be delighted that George Galloway might be distracted by somewhere else. But if I was a Labour Party strategist, I would think our best chance is do this while the Tories are distracted. And, you know, I mean, the Tories will probably still throw more at Leicester East than they would in North Shropshire. I think Cheshire and Amersham spook them, but I think they'll think, well, right, we should be okay. I mean, that's great and both of those things play into our hands. The issue of complacency was one of the big issues in Cheshire and Amersham that we picked up on the door. People saying, well, you know, we don't hear from our local Tories very much. And I'm sure that, and it happens in safe seats, Sam.
I think it's about, you know, people talk a lot about kind of progressive alliance and so on, and I'm not particularly a fan because I don't think the evidence necessarily backs it. But it's about intelligent campaigning and campaigning to your strengths, campaigning to where you can have an impact. You know, if you're not going to have an impact, why would you kind of pile in somewhere? So it makes sense for everybody to try and, you know, do those things. I can't see a strong argument almost on anybody's part to do anything different to what we're doing, and it even helps, you know, there's, as long as everybody stands, you know, we're giving people the opportunity to vote the way that they want, but we're recognizing kind of the allegiances that people already have and working to those. You know, it just seems sensible all round.
And Helen, no, we haven't yet selected our candidate for the by-election. I know you were the candidate in 2019, so it's important just to get that right for all listeners. But I take it the Risos are being charged and the orange ink drums are being purchased, and you guys will be ready to have leaflets and everything ready to go fairly soon, I imagine.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, we've had quite a busy week, and hopefully we'll be getting going as soon as possible.
Brilliant. So, like I say, to all those people, if you do need to find out more information, either contact the Shropshire Lib Dems themselves, or, like I say, go get on the North Shropshire by-election HQ. I think that will probably do us for by-election, unless anyone else has got anything before we start talking a little bit. David?
Well, the only thing I wanted to say, John, is just we obviously talked along the lines of, you know, corruption and scandals in Westminster, but one thing we also kind of briefly touched on was the general public's feeling about politicians and how this really damages them. You know, I know obviously you said that you only really had the opportunity to talk to Bosley about it, but I've had the benefit of having 2 weeks paternity leave and having several visitors and people telling me all sorts of things. And, you know, one thing that came up time and time again was this view that politicians seem to only go to Westminster to line their pockets. Now, that I think is awful, because there's, you know, I would say the vast majority of MPs go to Westminster to represent their constituency, represent their constituents. Most of the time it's the place they grew up in and have lived in, and they really want to change things. But is there a wider piece here of, even if we're not talking corruption or scandals, do we really need to address this idea of MPs at Westminster having 2, 3, more than 3 multiple jobs, and how that really damages the view of what our politicians are doing while they're at Westminster?
Yeah, that's actually a brilliant point, actually, because one thing that comes up, I mean, there's an argument, are we paying MPs enough? For me, I think, yes, they've had a very significant increase in pay because it was below, I think it was around 60,000. Now it's up beyond 80,000.
85,
now.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. So they have had, mainly because they took the decision outside of MP's hands, which was a correct thing to do. It's all done by an independent body. But I think you're right, David, because the issue about second jobs, etc. And again, I think it was Laura Gordon, one of our regulars, said like, this is about safe seats. You know, if you have an electoral system that the pressure on an MP doesn't come from their population but from their party, it leads to this sort of thing. So if Owen Paterson wasn't in a particularly safe seat, would he try this sort of nonsense? My guess is probably not.
No, I don't think he would. And I think actually, there's a number of things that we probably need to address in terms of the structural way that Westminster's run that would probably help us actually stop a lot of this happening. I mean, if you look at things like sitting hours during the week, obviously, let me separate out things like Monday and Thursday because MPs are travelling, so that's why they have later sitting hours. But if you look at, Tuesday and Wednesday, Parliament doesn't sit until, 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And you have to ask yourself, what are these MPs doing for the majority of that time in the morning? And in most cases, it's where people have maybe a second job in the city or they are doing another job and it gives them time to do that. Is that really what we want our MPs spending their time on when there's such important issues that need to be dealt with in the country at the moment? One thing I was going to say was, spending a bit of time talking about US politics in the past. This was something that I kind of thought was, US politics is really bad for lobbying and people having second jobs. It now seems to be that that's something that's becoming more prevalent in British politics. And the great comedian Bill Maher said, well, perhaps we need to start asking our politicians like NASCAR race drivers to wear the logos of the companies that they represent.
Yeah, before bringing the rest of the panel on this, one of the things that came up, we said when it came up on Twitter, Owen Paterson resigns, and all the people wondered from which job. That was the thing that came up. But any particular views on this from the rest of the panel?
I think there's an argument that, like a non-executive directorship, it can give you an insight into what's going on in industry. There are arguments as to why it's okay, but personally, I think they need to be limited in terms of how much time you can spend on them and how much salary you can earn from them. Because, the Randox example is one. He was earning more from that job than he was from being an MP. And therefore, again, it looks bad. Where do your loyalties lie? People are going to jump to a conclusion that may or may not be right. So I think they certainly need to be restricted very severely, if not got rid of.
I think the other thing as well is not just the jobs that they have, whilst being an MP at the same time, but also that idea of a revolving door. And there's been so little enforcement of that, especially at the ministerial level. And the number of times that I've seen sort of a minister going into a job after they've been a minister that just seems inappropriate, and in some cases is inappropriate. And there's been no sanction on that. It's happened again and again. So all of the rules, it's, multiple places, you're seeing the same lack of restriction and the same sense of kind of morality being, not existing. There isn't there's no moral case being made for this is not acceptable. And that's feeding through in all the decisions that you see are consistent with this idea of letting people get away with it.
Final word, Alison, on this whole topic goes to you, Alison.
I just wonder how they fit it all in. I'm quite busy as it is being a councillor. I imagine, if you're an MP, it's quite a demanding job. I imagine your inbox is absolutely crazy full of people who need your help. Are you really dealing with your constituents' needs, or are your eyes elsewhere?
Yeah, it's a brilliant point.
Could I make one final point on this, John?
Go on then, David.
I wanted to make one quick point, and that was the fact that I did laugh when I saw, and I wouldn't name names, but when I saw certain Labour MPs who were quite quick to criticise Owen Paterson, that when it came out, obviously, about Jeremy Corbyn accepting, 20 grand off of the Iranian Press TV to do work for them, that were stood defending him and saying that it was absolutely fine to do that. And I just think it's, very hypocritical of people to take that stance and then obviously criticise Owen Paterson.
I said, a root and branch review of, well, like I said, I think, I genuinely believe you can't have progressive politics without a progressive electoral system. It just encourages people to do bad things, unfortunately, and to take for granted what they've got. Because, like I said, we're all, well, half of us are local councillors, and it's just like, we don't get into it for the money or power, or, we wouldn't be Lib Dems, really, probably. But it's the fact that, we have to scrap usually for every single vote. And if you don't, then you can get very complacent. And I think that's what's happened here, unfortunately. Right, let's talk a little bit, shifting slightly onto the other big issue that's come up this week. We obviously had a deal with COP26 has been going on. Now, I don't know if this is controversial or if I'm going to get told off for this, but I have struggled to engage with what's happening. I felt it's been when China and Russia didn't attend. I felt that the outcomes of this were going to be fairly limited, and it looks like that. There's a lot of chat now saying, Greta Thunberg has been on saying the only success this conference has had is that it's united people, that they have to try harder. And I think that, I'm struggling. What does the rest of the panel think? What are their views of COP26 and what's happened this last week?
I think it's COP26 has struggled because of the reality of where we are at the moment in terms of the world. People's focus is very much elsewhere. There's big issues that we've just come through as a society, as a global society. But I think, first of all, I do sort of agree with Greta's sentiments there that we do need to do more. I think we need to do more on climate change as a whole, but I do think there are significant gains that have been made as a result of COP26. I think the one thing that's come out is obviously compared to Paris, when they had COP in Paris, where the global community only agreed to sort of cap emissions at 2.5 degrees Celsius increase. We've now got that down to, I believe it's 1.8. Obviously, the goal is to get it down to 1.5. So there's still quite a degree that needs to be done. But in terms of other countries making significant investments in smaller, less well-off nations who cannot make investments in renewable technology and green energy, we have seen significant gains. A lot of African nations have now been given significant funding to try and get them off of fossil fuels. And I think all of these are good things that should be celebrated. But as always, with global politics, we could and should be doing more.
Helen?
I'm going to declare an interest in this, in that I've been doing some work for one of the exhibitors at COP26. So fully declared, £120 I earned for doing some graphic design for somebody at COP26.
I'm sorry about this, listeners. I had no idea we had such a scandal in the Lib Dem pod.
Double job in it, Sam.
Yeah,
I know, it's outrageous. But having talked to them, I'm not to name names, but the lack of sort of attention to detail and organisation going on. They'd applied to have a session at COP26 where it was speakers and so on. And like a couple of days before the event, they didn't know if it was happening. They hadn't had any response back. They hadn't been told yes or no. And so they were literally waiting with a couple of days to go to see if they had like an hour session, at which point they would suddenly have to leap in and organise the speakers and get it all invited. They just didn't know what was going on. So the level, and they've, had been at previous COPs and it wasn't at that level. This is the worst organised, from what I've heard behind the scenes, COP that there has been. And so, talking about what is it going to achieve, I think part of that is the people who are involved aren't able to get on with the practical work of trying to deliver things. It's been really bad.
Yeah, I think there's been some interesting headlines coming out about reducing deforestation and reducing use of coal. To me, it all seems to have fallen a bit short. The big coal producers in the world aren't there, or China isn't there. They've not agreed to reduce their coal use. It feels a bit disappointing to me that the Indonesians are sort of rowing back a bit on the deforestation side of things. I think it's a bit of an opportunity missed. There has been some good news to come out of it, and we should welcome that. But to me, it seems like much more could have been achieved with stronger leadership ultimately.
Alison?
So I'm left with sincerely hoping that the outcome of COP26, is going to be positive and what the planet needs. Although I have a sort of sinking suspicion that it will fall well short, and what will happen after that. The thing I've been wondering about this week is how it looks to people who aren't in, the political bubble that we're in. I said when we were watching the news the other night, a lot of the coverage that the BBC have put out has been pre-prepared. It's been, here's the journalist, in the rainforests of Brazil, talking about deforestation, meeting people engaged in log cutting and sort of local tribes. And it's all pre-prepared stuff because there's not that much for the BBC to be able to say about what's going on a day-by-day basis. So I wonder, if I wasn't heavily engaged in politics and on Twitter and so on, what would my perception be as a normal person? And I suspect people are really turned off by it and quite depressed by it. But it would be really fascinating to know, if there are focus groups out there about perception on it, what that is.
I think I'm in the exact same place as you, Alison. I'm not sure the public is overly bothered. Obviously, really care about the issue. That's not what I'm saying. But about COP26, has that really cut through to the public? I'm not there, to tell you the truth. I don't think it has. But, there are things that are improved. There are stuff about countries not investing in coal, for example, in other countries. Now, obviously, one of the big issues is that China and America still are quite happy to invest in coal in their own countries. So everything is like kind of 2 steps forward, 1 step back at the moment. And I think that's the frustration we've got, because whether if we believe it's a climate emergency, then we've got to treat it like an emergency. And at the moment, I don't think we are just yet. But speaking about disappointments and green issues, I know, David, you do want to talk a little bit with your Scottish Lib Dem hat on about what's going on in Scotland regarding the Green Party and the SNP.
Yeah, look, I'm gonna go on a bit of a rant here, and I'm trying to temper
everyone.
And I'm trying to temper my West of Scotland vernacular and not swearing while I do this, because I appreciate this is not an adult-orientated podcast. Look, I had the pleasure or displeasure, if you will, of standing against Patrick Harvie, obviously, in Glasgow Kelvin when I ran for the Scottish Parliament elections. For anybody who's not aware, the Scottish Green Party is obviously separate from the Green Party of England and Wales. They have a different leadership structure. They're a completely separate party. They are obviously nationalist orientated, while they pertain to be the environmentalists of Scotland and standing up for the green issues. They've entered into a coalition agreement and have taken up 2 ministerial positions with the SNP. And the way that the mask has slipped within the couple of months that they've been in government of where their priorities lie, and the fact that Patrick Harvie, Lorna Slater, Ross Greer, the whole mob of them are interested in one thing, and that's independence, and they're willing to use a global stage like COP26 to say we are here to promote Scotland as an independent nation, as opposed to, maybe the thing that you were elected to do, which is promote environmentalism and green issues, is just absolutely laughable. And to see them then come out and attack Greenpeace for making the case against Nicola Sturgeon, not taking a position to say we will not open up more oil fields in Campbell, is just frankly boggles the mind, and it's laughable. To have Ross Greer go on TV as an apologist for Nicola Sturgeon and say, Greenpeace, they don't really understand Scotland and Scotland's politics, so they really shouldn't comment on it because they don't have an office here. I mean, it's effing enraging, because this is a climate agency that operates globally. It understands politics in places, part of the world that Ross Greer has never been to and has probably never seen. And their membership and their leadership has done more for the climate emergency than probably any of the Scottish Green Party elected officials have ever done. It just absolutely enrages me. And I really hope that they get their comeuppance, because when I raised this, I had members of the Scottish Green Party go, when you went into a coalition, you lied about tuition fees. This is the one thing that you are set out to deal with, and that's environmental disaster and the climate emergency. And you've just single-handedly pushed that aside for a coalition agreement and to back Nicola Sturgeon. And just to, namby-pamby sort of say, we're not going to talk about this Campbell oil field. It's absolutely enraging, and I hope more people pick up on it, and I hope they get their comeuppance as a result.
I don't know if this is because you've just kind of got a little bit angrier, David, but your background's suddenly got a lot brighter. I don't know if you've got some sort of kinetic light bulb energy going on there, but I mean, it is interesting when you look at the Green Party. I mean, like I said, I was a councillor during coalition and stuff, and you do have to hold your nose at times, but it does seem remarkable what the Green Lib Dems. Sorry, I'm not having to go to the Green Lib Dems. The Scottish Green Party has now got itself into. But do you think there will be a consequence to this, David?
I think, honestly, from what I've seen from a lot of people who voted Green, and look, I've been contacted by some people who connected with me when I ran in Glasgow Kelvin, which is obviously where Patrick Harvie stood. Young people who voted for him on the basis of the fact that he made this big stand for the environment, and he was there to obviously promote green issues for the next generation, who are angry and feel betrayed that they've decided to just sort of throw away all their ideals and policies to get into government, and I don't really know what they've achieved as a result of it. So I think it's going to be difficult for the Scottish Green Party. When they won't stand up to their coalition partners when they decide they're going to back a third runway for Heathrow, which is one of the things that they supposedly are very anti-against, when they won't stand up to their coalition partners, when they will not outright say whether they support or don't support further oil fields and production in Scotland, which is something that when I debated Patrick, he said he was absolutely committed against. I really don't know what they stand for if that's the case.
And I recommend to all our listeners and viewers, we did a whole episode about how Lib Dems should approach the Green Party, not just the Scottish Greens, but across the whole patch. So are the Greens our friend? So go check that out, because it was really interesting from local parties that have dealt with them and local parties that absolutely stand everywhere. Doesn't matter what the Greens kind of do. So do go check that out. I suppose the final thing on the Green Party is whether the Green parties have to find something else as their unique selling point at the moment, because if everyone's talking about green issues, and I'm really glad in Britain that it's not a kind of a massively polarizing issue, climate change, like it is in America. Democrats on one side, Republicans on the other. It is a very polarized. Actually, all the political parties have generally, I don't think there's many climate change deniers in any major political party now. But do we think the Greens are going to have to adapt? Do you think they're going to have to move away to adopt other things? There's a lot of ex-Corbyn supporters have joined the Greens in recent months. So are the Greens going to change themselves? I don't know if anyone else wants to come in on that.
I don't know how, if you were the Green Party, you could. I mean, it's such a fundamental of that's what they are. So how would you go about breaking that being the whole purpose of your party?
Well,
if you're going to campaign on something else, then that's not who you are.
Well, if I could make one point, John, and then I'll shut up and try and let other people talk. But for me, it stands in when you talked about, obviously, some disaffected Corbyn supporters have gone off and joined the Green Party. It's because the Greens view this sort of this lens of action on the environment and action on climate change can only be delivered through far left socialist principles. And as we've seen now, they will probably struggle with the fact that every party has shown that there is a way to deal with this issue without really tying it into that ideological view of the world. And I think they will seriously struggle when people start to realise that actually probably consumer trends are the biggest things that are pushing a lot of big companies and corporates to change the way that they're working.
Yeah. Alison, and how would you like to come on this?
Yeah, I think that the Greens have got a fair way to go yet on riding that wave of people being worried about the climate emergency and wanting to go to the ballot box and express that in some way. So I think it'll be a while before they have to start thinking about having a all-encompassing package of policies that they need to campaign on across the piece. I think it's also worth saying that my observation is that the people who are in the Green Party are quite a mixed coalition of people coming from all sorts of backgrounds. So you have your Corbynites, but you also have, sort of kind of the anti-housing, protect the countryside, sort of more small C conservative types. And it's an interesting mix that they've got to try and hold together and manage.
Yeah, I mean, I would probably agree with Alison. That's certainly what we see in when we speak to Green supporters here. I mean, quite a lot of young people as well voting Green. So I don't think that they need to start worrying about changing their message just yet. I think most people are engaged in environmental issues, and I think that if that's your top priority, then the Greens are attractive to you, to be quite honest with you. I think it's up to the rest of us to make the case that we have strong environmental policies and that we're, strong across the board, really.
And I do wonder, this is to round this off, because it actually goes on what Helen said and links into what David said there, is I can remember at the last general election, Greenpeace rated each manifesto. And I can remember the Green parties, I think us and the Greens were absolutely neck and neck in terms of green policies as part of our manifesto. And the Greens were furious with Greenpeace for doing it, because it takes away, again, their unique selling point in terms of if you want the climate, then we are the people to do it. And actually, the fact is Lib Dems were just as green and would as good in the last general election in our manifesto. So we will see. But maybe there's the Green versus Greenpeace fight might continue, David. We'll see what comes up. But thank you so much, guys, for coming on this podcast. It's been absolutely brilliant. Remember, to everyone everywhere, if you can help out in North Shropshire, please do find out. There's always ways you can do it, whether that's in person or remotely. I want to thank everyone for being on this. So thank you, Helen. Thank you, Alison. Thank you, Sam. And thank you, David. My name is John Potter. You can catch everything to do with the Lib Dem podcast at Lib Dem Pod. Thank you very much to our Patreon subscribers who do throw us a little bit of money every month to keep the podcast going. We really appreciate that. We get no funding from Central Party whatsoever. And if you've got any comments about this issue, I mean, we talk about Owen Paterson. What has been your main takeaway from this scandal? What do you think the Lib Dems should be doing? How hard should we be fighting? What do you think about Leicester East? And what do you think about COP26 as well? We love hearing your feedback on it, especially on YouTube as well, where we get the most comments coming through. So thank you. As always on YouTube, you get the most comments. But thank you so much to everyone. Thank you to our panel. And we're back with another episode very soon.